Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale, radio-controlled Armortek King Tiger tank. Since the last video update, I made a lot of progress to the tank's top deck, as well as also the turret and the turret rotation system. We'll be going over all of these additions and modifications in this video, so stay tuned, because there's going to be a lot of info coming at you. Now, as a quick recap from the last video update, where I went ahead and installed the magnet locking system, which, once the deck is completely assembled, it'll be able to secure the deck to the vehicle in a secure manner, but it's a temporary bond in case you need to get access to the electronics or the mechanical components on the interior portion of the hull. Now, for the panels themselves, these are the stock original panels, but they have been modified slightly in order for them to fit onto the deck. For them to fit onto the hull, there was some slight hand fitting that was required to be made to either side, and this information is mentioned in an earlier video update. Now, from this point on, I'm going to go ahead and complete the magnet locking system for the top deck, as well as also getting the unit assembled and having a few other provisions mounted to this section over here. Let's get started. Alright, now here we have the front top plate, like I mentioned before. I went ahead and marked it where the plates are going to go for the magnet lock system. But in addition to that, I'm also going to be mounting on this little frame that we have here. This frame is going to be for the front hatch access panel that is found on the King Tiger. Now, this is something that has not changed from the Armortek kit since the Armortek was released by them back around 10 years or so ago. Only on that kit, I believe the original was possibly made from steel, but I'm a little bit hazy on that. Regardless, the design stayed exactly the same. The way this works is you just simply bolt it to the bottom portion here of the plate, and this gives you the little lip here that the hatch access plate just mounts directly onto. Now here you can see the piece up close. Note that Armortek went ahead and bored out all these locations so that once the fasteners are added, it leaves for a nice flush appearance on the top deck. Now this is true to form to the real vehicle. The real vehicle utilized a system basically identical to the way you see it here on the Armortek model. The only difference, however, is with the fasteners that are used to secure these pieces in place. Now, on the stock Armortek kit, they want you to utilize M3 by 12 cap screws in order to secure these to the deck. These are those black ones that use an Allen wrench drive in order to secure them. However, on the real vehicle, they were actually just standard hex bolts. Now, this is one modification that I made to my other King Tiger as well, and it really does improve the look over using the stock setup. Now, here I have a M3 by 12 fastener, or I believe this might be a 16. Yeah, it's a 16. Regardless, when it comes time for just swapping them out, you can't just simply replace one with the other, because when you try to put it in, you'll notice that the bore is slightly smaller than the head of the hex bolt. In order to go ahead and modify this plate so that it fits these bolts, with a drill bit, I'm just going to enlarge these sections that we have here. Now, this has to be done on a drill press. I can't stress this enough. If you don't have a drill press, this modification is definitely something that you want to avoid. With the drill press, however, you just set the bit to the height it needs to go, and you'll just ream out these little sections over here that are already pre-machined by Armortek. Once all the units are drilled out and expanded, I can then go ahead and secure these pieces to the vehicle. Now, this hole here I did as a test to show exactly how much larger the hole needs to be compared to the one found on the stock model. Here I have that hex bolt that I showcased before, and if I just drop it in, you can see just how it goes in without making contact with the walls of the hole. From here, I'm going to go ahead and execute the same procedure to the remainder of the fasteners. And here's the top plate, now ready to go through its hole enlargement procedure. Now, for the job, like I said before, a drill press is going to be absolutely mandatory to do this procedure. Now, for the drill press itself, I'm using my larger capacity drill press. Now, I do have a smaller 8-inch tabletop drill press, and that is more than suffice to do this job at hand, so you don't have to have this large capacity unit. In fact, the first King Tiger I did on that other drill press, and it came out just fine. I will say, though, that the larger capacity drill press does make it a little bit easier due to the larger surface area of the table, and it's also, more importantly, for the purposes of this video, it's easier to prop up the tripod to film on this drill press as opposed to the other one. Now, the drill bit is mounted in the chuck. Unfortunately, I don't know the size offhand, but magically via the art of editing, right here, you're going to see the drill bit size. With the drill bit information now out of the way, the other things to point out is the most important aspect, which is the height of the table, but most importantly, the depth, or I should say the lack thereof, of the drill bit chuck. This needs to be set and calibrated absolutely perfectly, because if you over drill into this piece, you run the risk of drilling directly through the plate, which will basically destroy the hole, and at that point you're pretty much screwed. You're not permanently screwed, but it is going to basically ruin your day, and you're going to have to plug it up. It's just another procedure that is just going to cause some headaches. But if you properly set the drill bit height, that's not going to be an issue. Now, drilling through the aluminum is pretty easy to do. It's a much softer metal compared to something like steel, and luckily for all of the Armortek King Tigers, all of the releases utilize a alloy aluminum plate for the top deck. Now I am just going to put a small little drop of oil on the bit just to keep it well lubricated. And from here, let's go ahead and start the drilling. Well, that's all there is to it. The holes have all been modified, so now when it comes time for mounting on that frame plate that I had before, I'm just going to simply swap out the kit supplied fasteners with the hex bolts. And here are the top deck plates now going through their assembly work. Starting with the one in the front, here you can see the inner plate has now been fitted, and you can see how the fasteners look once mounted to the leading edge here. Now on the interior portion, here you can see the two magnet connecting points that have been fitted. Obviously these need to be mounted because the top decks are aluminum. They're not going to stick to the magnets found on the hull. The plates are simply just threaded into the metal plate. Now luckily the plates are nice and thick. Because of that, this gives you a lot of material to tap with the thread, so an external fastener is just not needed. You just, once the pieces are tapped, the plates just get threaded directly in place via a fastener. Now the external fastener, or I should say the external portion of the fastener that remains, just gets amputated away with a Dremel, with a cutting stone, and then the residual scratch over here is just going to be polished away with a little bit of body work, but more on that is to come. Now on the rear plate, same story. Here I have the interior magnet locks now fitted, and also the portions of the threaded sections were removed that emerged from the top plate. Also, you notice that the two top plates are now primed in their red coloring, and from here they can be attached. Now for the attachment point, that's going to be the job of this ring that we have here. Now this ring, if anyone is a frequent viewer of the channel, this should be very familiar to you. On many of the older Armortek tanks, they originally had this brass bushing, which is used as basically as a bushing, and it's what the turret actually glides along during its rotation. This system was basically used by Armortek since the beginning, only have been recently phased out on their very recent releases with the ball bearing system, like I mentioned in the last Tiger 1 build video that I did. Having said that though, I'm actually a big fan of this system. It's simplistic and it works very, very well. The turret basically just sits onto the hull with gravity and it doesn't ever cause any problems. Now, in order to secure the ring to the top deck, you'll notice that there are several countersunk fasteners along the leading edge over here, and they have corresponding locations found on the top decks. The holes do line up, and so the pieces will simply get fastened together. Once the ring is mounted to both of the top decks, at that point the top deck will basically be one piece, and at that point there I can progress to the next portion of the build. Okay, well after a few minutes with the Allen wrench and a socket driver, the brass ring is now permanently attached to the two hull plates. Of course, needless to say, of all the fasteners that you see on this section over here, red Loctite was utilized on every single one of them. Now, like I was saying before, the ring on this build here is going to serve two functions. It's going to act as the actual turret bearing, but most importantly, it's also going to act as the section that joins these two plates together. With the way the piece is fastened on, it's a nice strong assembly. There's no play or wobble or anything, and it's going to be more than suffice for the task at hand. Now, for the seam lines that we have on these two locations here, these are present on the real King Tiger, and on this model here, these are going to be covered up with the weld bead detailing, which will come shortly after this video. Just like the weld beads, I'm also going to be plugging up the other fastener location holes that we have on the top plates, which on the kit originally would have been used to permanently secure these plates to the hull of the vehicle. Obviously, with the magnet system, these here are just an appendix and are no longer going to be necessary. Now, once the upper deck is together, I went ahead and readjusted the magnets. Like I mentioned in the last video, the magnets were mounted to this internal frame here that I fabricated, but the heights of the magnets weren't set yet at that point because, of course, I needed to have the deck made. Now that the deck is made and the steel pieces have been mounted along the inside, it's now time to set the magnets. Now, I went ahead and did this off camera, just to, spare you, just me adjusting the heights on them, but the heights were adjusted, so now when the piece connects, you're going to hear several clicks, which is the magnets just locking onto their respective surfaces. Now, let's give it the tug. And it is held on.
Yeah, bitch! Magnets! Oh!
Now that had to have been done. Now, with the pieces on, a good little tug is all that's required in order to get the lid off. From here, I can now do the body work on these other locations, which would have originally been used for those fasteners. Obviously, they're not needed anymore, so they can be just plugged up and blended away. With the top deck now assembled and ready for mounting, it's now time to shift to the other bits of equipment that get fitted to this piece. One of which, and it's actually one of the most important parts for this build, is the turret rotation system. Now, for the turret rotation system, that's comprised of the components that we have here on the table. Now, if anyone is a frequent viewer of this channel and have followed the other Armortek builds that I've done over the years, this setup here should look basically familiar because it's been relatively untouched since Armortek first started making their kits back in 2002. Starting with the electric motor, which is probably the most important part of this whole system. The electric motor consists of the motor and a pre-geared unit. We have the system that is pre-wired, and it's ready to hook up directly to the Armortek electronics. Now, a lot of people always ask me, either via an email or in the comment sections, about, they're working on a homebrew RC tank of one sort or another, and what do you use for the motors? Where do you find them? And so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I can't really answer those questions because the motor that you see here, as well as the other motors that are used on these builds, come supplied with the Armortek package. So I can't really help out whenever people ask me that question. Now, here goes the motor specs right here. Now, I'm pretty certain that finding 12 volt or 24 volt electric DC motors, specifically ones that are geared like this, shouldn't be too hard to do with a quick Google search, and I'm pretty sure you'll yield some pretty good results. Back to this model at hand. So the motor, again, like I mentioned before, basically standard on these Armortek kits. And then moving takes us to the bracket. This mounting bracket is CNC'd out of aluminum and is custom fit for these motors here, and are all held together via fasteners. Again, this is stock with the kit. Moving on further takes us to the rotation gear. Now, the gear itself, spec-wise, is identical to the ones that have been made by Armortek on previous releases, but within recent years, they kind of changed the design. If we go back to some of the earlier releases, like the early production Tiger 1, or even the Panther that I did a number of years ago, the gear is actually comprised of two sections. We have a steel gear, and then there is a brass spindle section that the gear is wedged onto. Within recent years, Armortek replaced that system outright and just have an entirely CNC'd one-piece gear system like this guy here. With this design, it's a more advanced type design because everything is just one solid piece and there's no chance of there being any slippage. The piece is drilled and tapped and gets mounted to this flat section that we have here found on the spindle. Because of this design, slippage is not going to be something that you're going to run into with these systems. From here, I'm going to go ahead and get this guy in a coat of primer, and then I'll be able to get the motor fully assembled. And here's the motor mount now fully assembled and ready for installation. The unit itself was predominantly assembled out of the box with most of the kit supply fasteners. Like I said before, these units assemble very quickly and pretty much effortlessly. Now, the one modification I did make was to the fastener for the gear. Now, the kit supplies you with a flush grub screw, which gets fit into place and it's what secures the gear to the spindle of the motor. Now, on several of my builds, I tend to replace the grub with a standard cap screw, and one of the reasons why is that I always found that the standard cap screws are more robust and are less prone to stripping as opposed to the grubs. The grubs, that's one thing I always notice about them. They tend to strip a little bit easier when it comes time for tightening them down. That's not really a problem with the standard bolt that we have here. Now keep in mind, on the shaft there is a flat section which makes this piece, once you crank down on it, impossible to loosen and to rotate off the spindle. Now, of course, red Loctite was utilized on all these fasteners that we have here. Now, one thing about the cap screw is that you notice that the motor, or I should say the gear, is going to stick up slightly above the bracket. Now, this is also mostly true again with the grub screw as well. And because of that, you always, or I always ran into the need to create some kind of a spacer for the bracket. Because if you try to mount it out of the box, the gear is going to make contact with the top portion of the hull and that brass bushing, and it's just going to lead to problems. So the spacer is required just so that you can lower the gear just enough so it makes clearance with the top portion of the deck. Now, some people are going to say, well, the reason why you need that spacer is because you added this fastener here, which then in turn elevates the gear. Well, it does elevate the gear slightly. It's just like maybe a millimeter at best, but keep in mind that even with the original grub screw, the motor still sticks above the bracket regardless. So the spacer is really something that needs to be done regardless. Now, on Armortek's newer kits, they go ahead and give you an actual machine spacer that does the exact same job. So this is a recurring thing I've noticed on a lot of these on these builds. Now, in order to fabricate the spacer, you can do it a couple different ways. Some people have used washers in order just to give you just that slight amount of gap between the top deck and the gear over here. This washer technique is definitely a viable one and is one that is doable. Another way is a little bit more elaborate, but works for the same way, is I went ahead and made a new spacer out of a piece of Lexan. Now, you can use a multitude of materials for this, anything from brass to steel, aluminum, what have you, but for the application at hand, the nylon, or I should say the Lexan piece, is more than suffice. Now, the thickness is 1/8 of an inch, which will give you plenty of clearance, but will still be able to engage with the turret gear found on the bottom portion of the turret. And to just show the type of clearances that are required, here we have the top deck. These two holes here are the mounting holes for this system. Now I'm just going to hold the unit on so you get to get an idea of exactly how much clearance remains. Hopefully I can get this in frame. There we go. And there you can see that little black space between the brass and the gear. That's total free space, which is exactly what you're looking for in order to clear any of the physical obstructions from the top deck and the brass ring, which means the gear will be uninhibited in doing its job in rotating the turret. And here's the motor and the motor mount now securely fitted to the top deck. Now, the fasteners, again, are the kit supply ones, but one change that I made was with the nuts that we have here. A common procedure, or addition I should say, that I like to add to these Armortek turret rotation motors is the replacement of just the standard hex nut with a nylock fastener. In addition to the nylock, I also generally tend to add a lock washer just to keep everything firmly and permanently mounted where you see them on this model. Keep in mind, this is one of those components that has to absolutely not have any move or wiggle to it whatsoever. If there is any sort of play on this piece here, it'll just lead to way more issues down the road. So you want to have this guy firmly mounted in the place that you see it here. If I go ahead and try to rotate or twist the unit, you'll see there's absolutely no play, and this thing is on in a rock solid manner. Also, with that spacer that I mentioned before, you can see exactly the clearance that the rotation motor gear has from the brass bushing ring. And here are the mounting fasteners on the exterior portion of the turret. Note that with the way the kit is designed, the fasteners are below the deck surface, which make for a nice flush appearance. Now, when it comes to these type of holes, I tend to leave them exposed without doing any body work to cover and conceal them. The rationale behind that is if there's ever any sort of an emergency and the motor or the motor mount needs to be removed, if these units here are plugged up with the bodywork, I'm going to have to destroy that in order to get access in order to remove the motor. With leaving them exposed, that's not going to be the case. Now, they aren't going to be an eyesore because with the size and shape of the King Tiger turret, it is so large that I doubt it very much that these pieces here will be exposed. Now, with the turret rotation mechanism fitted to the top deck, it's now time to turn my attention to the turret itself. Now, the turret I haven't really talked about in much detail since the project start all the way back then. But here we have the turret body shell now assembled, and from here it could progress to the next step. Now, on the Armortek kit, the turret is going to be a massive bit of equipment in not just its dimensions, but also in its weight. By the time everything is said and done, when it gets the roof panels, the gun barrel, the elevation, the hatches, all of that stuff, the turret is probably going to weigh in at around maybe 60 to 70 pounds, so it's definitely no lightweight. To put things in perspective, here I have a Taken 1/16 scale Tiger 1 turret, and it's the turret easily fits inside of the larger shell of the Armortek's. Now, just like with the front glacis plate, the front armor plate here is to scale thickness, and it is about 1 inch in thickness, and the turret sides come in around 1/2 inch apiece. Now, everything is pre-bent to the way you see it here. Now, the kit assembles just like with the hull, where it's all fastener assembly with the use of these aluminum blocks that are on the inside. Let me bring the camera in closer to point out something when it comes time for assembling of these turrets. Now, one change that Armortek made with the way the turrets assemble from their previous release back in 2010 was with these two slots that we have here. On the original King Tiger release, these were just standard inset holes like the ones that are found on the remainder of the vehicle, but for some reason they decided to add these as an adjustable type slot system. I guess this has to do with the alignment of the panels. By going with this slot assembly, it aids in the ease of construction. Now, I will say that trying to get the panels to fit on was a bit on the fiddly side. There was some hand fitting required to be made to the puzzle sections here on the rear. Not so much on the front or the sides, but really trying to get this rear panel mounted was a bit of a chore. But once everything was filed away, the turret obviously was able to be assembled to the state that you see it here. Now, one procedure that is going to be absolutely crucial if you're building one of these turrets and you don't want to screw it up has to do with these two bolts that we have sticking out of this rear plate. Now, with the way the Tiger kit is designed, you have these hinges that will thread onto these two sections over here, and that's going to facilitate the hinge work for the rear ammunition hatch once everything is fleshed out. But if you look at the way the piece is designed, you have to thread the hinge work onto the rear plate just prior to the assembly of the turret. Why this is important is because a lot of people, when they are assembling these models, they just go ahead, throw the panels together, and by and large this generally works. But in this situation, it's going to bite you in the ass, because once you get this plate on, you're not going to be getting access to those fasteners in any time soon. Now, because the hinge work is going to be part of the detailing on the rear hatch, that is going to be added subsequently later on, but during the turret shell assembly, I went ahead and pre-fitted the fasteners in place just to prevent any sort of problems. And this is definitely something you're going to want to do on your build when it gets time to assembling of the turret. Now, I'm pretty sure the most current release of the Armortek King Tiger may have this feature, so you want to keep this in mind when it comes time to your build. Oddly enough, though, when I was working on the first generation King Tiger, the design was slightly different than you see it here. So this is something that is more prevalent on 2013 and onward Armortek King Tiger releases. Now that the main shell is fully assembled, what's going to be next is the turret rotation neck. Now, the neck on this pattern of the King Tiger is very similar to the previous generations, where we have two more pieces. The first piece is a CNC'd aluminum ring that we have here. I guess it basically acts as a spacer and what elevates the deck from the turret. And the next ring is the all-too-common Armortek geared tooth ring that we have here. Now, this type of a system should look very familiar, as it's been used on almost all of the Armortek kits that you've seen on the ECA channel thus far. Now, I'm not sure if this was redesigned on their most current release, because lately Armortek looks like they've been trying to move away from the system and more towards that Lazy Susan ball bearing type ring system that was seen on their last Tiger 1. So if you have one of those King Tigers that just came out, possibly that's the system on your build, or they might have kept this one. It's hard to say, as I've yet to build one of those releases. But for this one here, this is the standard on Armortek kits for a long period of time. Now, for the gear itself, it is made from a laser cut, 1/8 inch thick piece of steel plate. Now, you notice there is some surface rust on here. This is kind of the norm, specifically on models that have been opened up for a period of time. Normally, these come in that oil wax paper that tends to protect the surface from any sort of corrosion. But this is just simple surface rust and will be addressed prior to everything going into primer and then assembly. Now, on these pieces, I like to pre-prime them just prior to getting them fully assembled. I like the idea of having specifically the steel piece here thoroughly coated in primer. It just prevents any sort of further corrosion to incur. And here's the exact same ring now. After some passes with the palm sander, all of the surface rust has been deleted, and from here the piece is going to go directly into primer. And here's the turret now with its coat of red primer and with the rotation ring now fitted. If I flip the turret on its side and over, you can see the ring and the neck now mounted to the model. Now, for the mounts, this is utilizing the kit supply fasteners, which are these 6 that we have here. The kit does supply you with washers in order to mount them to the fasteners, but I went ahead and added some extra bit of hardware on the inside. Let me reflip it over so you get to see. And here are the fasteners from the inside. Note the amount of threads which emerge from the mounting nut. Now, these bolts need to be very long just to get through that sheer mass of material which comprises the turret floor. Now, on my last King Tiger build, I went ahead and shortened these sections over here, making the unit lower in profile. And one of the reasons why I did that was to prevent any sort of a chance of any of the wires that are on the inside portion of the turret snagging and possibly spooling up around these long fasteners that we have here. More than likely, I'm going to do the same procedure to this build here for the same reasons, and this mod will be done momentarily. Now, like I said before, the fasteners are kit supplied, but I went ahead and changed the mounting nut. The kit supplies you with the washers, the bolts, and the hex nuts in order to secure everything in place, but I went ahead and replaced the stock hex nut with some nylocks. In addition to the nylocks, I also went ahead and added a lock washer to the bottom portions. These fasteners, once tightened and fitted in place, never need to be removed ever again. And because of that, I want to ensure a nice, tight, strong bond, because you also want to prevent this piece from shifting or moving due to the way the turret rotation mechanism works. In addition to the nylon hex hex nut, as well as the lock washer. Red Loctite was also utilized, again, really keeping these firmly in place and preventing any sort of slippage or loosening as the model ages and gets used. Well, in a strange turn of events, when it came time to mount the turret to the ring, it didn't fit. The tolerances on the brass ring and that aluminum neck were too tight and snug to the point where I couldn't even able to get it fit inside of the turret hole. Well, needless to say, this is definitely something that is going to be an issue. Now, fortunately, I've run into this problem before, and I have solved it on a couple builds. Most recently was the first generation Armortek Tiger, and even more recently was on the British Firefly that I did going on a couple of years ago now. Regardless, the way the issue is resolved is with the same method, and that is with using the drill that I have here. Now, on the drill, we have a giant sanding drum. This is nothing more than a scaled up version like the ones you see on the Dremel. Now, for the drill, you notice I have this handle on it. This handle is to ensure that when I'm removing the material, it's being held in a perfect 90-degree angle, because with this type of modification, if you have any sort of cant to the brass, it's just going to cause some more problems with trying to get everything lined up. So you want to keep the drill pointed in a straight down manner so you remove the even amount of material. Along with that, you also want to make sure that you move in a nice constant circular motion so that you don't remove more material on one side compared to the other. Now, there is a slight margin of error, so it doesn't have to be 100% laser point exact, but if you make the hole oblong to the point where the turret is going to start shifting when it comes time for it rotating. So this is a very serious procedure, and one that should only be done if you have the know-how and the tooling in order to do this. Now, if you also notice, I am outdoors, and there's a reason for that. One, it's a nice day, but the second reason is because of the amount of particulate that this method kicks up. You are going to have quite a mess. So doing it outdoors is definitely going to be beneficial. Also, you are going to need to wear safety glasses and a respirator during this procedure for reasons which should be pretty obvious. Now, the top deck itself is sitting on this garbage can, which is at the moment filled with water, which is actually a good thing because it keeps it nice and anchored down, and you don't want to have the top deck wobbling on you during the procedure. Last but not least, the turret rotation motor, which I fitted earlier, had to have been removed. This needs to not be present so that you have a nice access to the sidewalls here so you can remove the material in an even manner. And I gotta say, removing those two fasteners was a pain. I did a really good job with the type of fasteners and with the methods that I used. So getting them off was definitely something that was a chore, but I guess that's part of the job, is to keep it in a nice, firmly mounted state. Hopefully, once all this is said and done, I got the turret spinning freely, I can remount the motor in the same way, which will keep it where it needs to be. However, let's go ahead and start the grinding. Okay, here's the particulate that you see what I was referring to. Yeah, you definitely don't want any of the stuff in the shop. It's gross. Well, remove some material. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be enough, but it's best to do a little bit and then check and verify with the turret, just so you make sure that you don't over-remove the amount of material that's needed. Also, it's a great way to verify if there are any sticky areas which may have not been sanded down as evenly as the other surfaces. So you have to concentrate on those areas, making sure everything is where it needs to be. Okay, so after some passes, I got the material removed to the point where the turret fits into place and seats fully onto the bearing, which is a positive sign. Now, when I try to rotate it, though, you can see how it's sticking in a few locations. This needs to be addressed at this point here, because It's one of those things where if you go ahead and assemble it, be like, oh, it's going to break in. That's not going to be the case. You're just going to end up burning the motor, and you're going to have a turret system that just doesn't function properly. So you're going to need to continue to remove some more material. But like I said before, with this type of a method, now you could find out where exactly these tighter spots are, so you can address them with the removal process. Okay. Get this behemoth out of here. Generally, a telltale where the thing is sticking is you'll have some paint sections that are, or paint scrapes found on the sections of the ring. Like, right here's one, and right here's another. So, I'm going to go with a couple more passes, but I'm going to focus primarily on these locations that I saw before. Okay, let's give this a shot now. Alright, see how the turret just went straight into its proper location? That is what you're looking for. That's a good sign. Now, I just grab the turret and spin it. Oh, by the way, one thing to watch out for when rotating this turret by hand is the corners and the mass that it has when moving. Yeah, it can cause a bit of a ding on your skin, and it does quite sting. Alright, let's go ahead with my hands clear this time. Let's go ahead and get this guy spun. Alright, that is what we're looking for. Try in the reverse direction. Absolutely perfect. It's funny how it kind of sounds like it has a turret turner fitted at this point, but we're not there yet. All right, from this point here, I believe I'm good with the removal. What I am going to do, though, I am going to take some emery cloth or some fine sandpaper just to file down the leading edge over here on the bushing. Probably give it a slight bevel, which will help get the turret seated in place once it's fully assembled. Also, it will remove any burrs from the sanding process that I've just done. Now, I also want to point out what's interesting is that on my last King Tiger, the one I built from the 2010 group, it didn't need this procedure. The turret ring was basically good to go out of the box. It was in spec. I just mounted it on, and the build just, flowed. But on this one here, just a little bit more hand fitting was required. However, now that you see the procedure at hand, if this happens to you, or if you get one of these legacy kits and it does feature this type of tooling and you run into this problem, note it's not all is lost, and you can deal with it and get your model up and running. Alright, well, that should do the trick. Like I said before, I went over it with some sandpaper. Now both the top, the leading edge, and the inside portion are much smoother than they were before after the grinding. Let's see how it fits on now that the polishing is done. Oh, that's nice. That is good. And that's what we're looking for. So, from here, I'm going to take this giant, heavy turret off again, remount on the turret rotation system. Then we're going to see if the motor can actually rotate this giant turret under its own steam. Alright, so now here we have the top deck, which is suspended on these two buckets over here, so I can test the turret rotation. Turret is mounted to the top deck. Of course, the rotation motor was remounted to the top deck with the same procedure that I used before, so all the strength has been returned to that unit. Currently off screen right now, I have two small 12-volt batteries hooked up in series to give it the 24 volts needed. Now, let's see if the turret rotates. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go in the opposite direction now. And that is really perfect. There's nothing really much more you can ask for a turret rotation system. Now, generally, towards the end of the build on that brass bushing that we saw earlier, I usually wipe a small little smear of grease just to give a little bit more lubrication to help the turret rotate. But currently, the way you see it, the turret is completely dry. There's no other lubricants on it, and it's still rotating pretty well. Now, the two little batteries I have aren't exactly fully charged, and the amp hourage on them is very, very low, but it's still doing the job. Well, with the top deck, the turret rotation, even most of the turret's construction now out of the way, this is undoubtedly a huge step forward in the tank's production. Well, from here I could finish off the front hatch area, and this will spill over into me completing off many of the other external detail fittings that are needed on the hull. And with the turret rotation system now mounted, I could flesh out the remainder of the interior space required for the other mechanical and electrical systems. But more information on all of that is to come in the next project update video. However, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek German King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, be it large-scale project update videos like this guy over here, or the smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted all the way since its project start, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been showcased on the ECA channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for stopping by.